Today's conversation is an interview with Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple, who has her PhD in integrative physiology. She is the co-owner of Mass Research Review, and she is an expert in women's health and physiology, which was the topic of today's conversation. We talked about what are some of the main myths surrounding women's health online, why women struggle with weight loss and body composition improvements during peri and post-menopause, how to train around the menstrual cycle, and much, much more. I hope you enjoy it. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Lauren, there's so much misinformation floating around about women's health and fitness online, from hormones to cardio to fasted cardio, intermittent fasting. What is the biggest myth you see hurting women right now the most?
I think the theme is women are so different and we need to worry about so many of these nuances, and it just really overcomplicates everything. I hear women need to worry about pre and post workout nutrient timing, that women past a certain age should stop doing zone 2 cardio and have to do HIIT. And there's a lot of you must do this or you should never do that kind of language. And that's really harmful because if people are confused and feel like they can't even engage in fitness in the quote unquote right way, then they're just going to avoid fitness at all costs.
Yeah, and I think that parallels the nutrition space very well, too, in terms of it's very dichotomous, right? Very black and white. You either eat these foods and they're great, or you don't eat these foods because they're horrible for you. Can you give us some specific examples that you're seeing in the women's fitness space?
One example is that you should absolutely never train fasted because it's going to increase your cortisol, it's going to wreak havoc on your hormones, it will increase body fat accumulation, break down lean mass. There's a lot of fear-based messaging around cortisol.
Yeah, and where do you think these claims come from in the first place?
I think cortisol is getting a really bad rap because chronically elevated cortisol is a problem that's associated with some disease states that need to be addressed by a medical professional. But the kind of kernel of truth from that experience in a disease population is then being transitioned into messaging for otherwise healthy people. And cortisol fluctuations are normal and not something that we need to worry about.
Yeah, it's I bring this up because, again, I see a lot of the same sort of messaging in the nutrition space. It's essentially lack of nuance. It's lack of nuance and extrapolation, right?
Yes.
Um, since this is me interviewing you, do you mind going a little bit deeper into that, into where some of these messages lack nuance, where there is maybe a bit of truth to it, where there's extrapolation, where there isn't any actual clinical evidence to it? I know we're going to talk about some big names in this space in a little bit, but I saw your story that you posted the other day, right, around some particular claims around cortisol specifically, I believe. You're like, where's the clinical evidence to support this, right? And there's difference between animal research or cell culture studies and actual clinical research. I think it's probably important to go into that so that the audience understands why people make these claims in the first place, what aspects of them are true and what aspects aren't.
So I think generally you can find a study to support anything you want to say. Um, and
Unfortunately.
and if we are good scientists and science communicators, if we're being truly evidence based, we look at the literature as a whole. We
Mhm.
don't pick single studies, and people are really using science as a marketing tool and saying, "Oh, well, because I want to sell you a program or sell you my book or sell you my hormone balancing coaching or whatever the service or product is." A lot of the messaging is you're broken and you need to be fixed.
Mm.
So when we think about fasted training, for example, the nuance there is some people don't feel well training fasted. Some people feel like they perform much better with some fuel on board, if you will. Other people, especially those who train early in the morning, maybe prefer to train fasted and then eat afterwards. And so it really just comes down to personal preference. However, if you are a high level athlete doing a ton of intense training or really long endurance exercise sessions, is fasted training optimal for performance? Maybe not, but that's just comes down to individual goals and preferences. And so this idea that it's so black and white and you must never do this is messaging that I'm seeing more and more of, that I really think I hope we can get away from.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And again, that's where the topic of nuance comes into play, right? Because even if we talk about fasted training and my team and I, we actually we're working with clients who ask these questions all the time. And they're like, well, I enjoyed fasted training. And like most of the general population isn't training hard enough or long enough to where whether they're fasting or not is going to have a massive impact on their performance, right? That's one thing I think about. It's like, well, I definitely try not to train fasted because I really care about my performance and I'm in the gym for at least 90 minutes plus. And if I don't eat, I start to get shaky. I notice I can't do as much total work. But the vast majority of people don't have to really worry about that. Would you say that's true?
I think that's true. I also think if by avoiding fasted training, you then train less because, hey, if I can only go early in the morning, but I'm not going to go because that would mean I was training fasted and I absolutely should never do that. That's the problem because really, maybe you don't train at the same time every day, and that's fine. And we want to be consistent with our training however we can. And busy people, maybe some days you train early in the morning, maybe some days you train after work. And so giving people the freedom to have that flexibility is really important.
Yeah. Are you saying that consistency is more important than perfection?
I would say that.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes we let perfection get in the way of consistency, right? So objectively, when it comes down to performance, what does the literature show in terms of not intermittent fasting, fasted training overall?
Again, for your kind of average person, and honestly, most resistance training, unless it's really, really long sessions, we might see a dip in performance on average for those really intense sessions. And if you're doing long distance endurance exercise, but it's not enough of a performance dip that I would really worry too much about it. And all of this other fear about cortisol or increasing body fat from fasted training, losing lean mass from fasted training, we don't put on body fat and lose muscle in a half hour period based on what we ate pre-workout. And training doesn't make you lose muscle. So I don't know where that message is coming from, but fat
Yeah.
loss is about a calorie deficit, and muscle growth is about resistance training, and all of this other stuff is just noise.
Yeah. And I think that, aspect of like losing muscle if you train fasted might come from the misconceptions of increases in cortisol. I definitely want to talk about the role of cortisol because there is so much confusion, right? You mentioned earlier acute fluctuations in cortisol concentrations versus chronic elevations being two totally different things. I talk about this in the context of nutrition with things like insulin or blood sugar or inflammation in general, right? Like people don't understand what the difference between acute fluctuations are and chronic elevations. I did want to bring up one thing though, because you had mentioned, what did we just talk about? There's this, okay, fasted training in general. There's this one doctor, and I cannot remember her name, but I made a video about it the other day. At least she says she's a doctor, but like the things she says are so far out left field that they don't seem, it's different, like twisting the truth a little bit to sound unique or smart, and then like saying stuff that just makes no sense. So she was mentioning that, and this is where the confusion comes into that fasted exercise is amazing because one, you're in a deep state of ketosis, which is not true because it takes time to be in ketosis. And then two, since you have no exogenous glucose, you're just going to use up all of your glycogen stores. So then you can tap into fat and it helps you, her words, not mine, lean out your muscles. And I'm like, what are you talking about? First off, we use glycogen regardless, right? Like it's whether there's exogenous glucose or not, we're using glycogen. You still have blood sugar. It's not at zero just because you didn't eat overnight. You're not in ketosis. Like there's so much confusing messaging online.
Yeah, I think people are so confused about fuel utilization and what that actually means for your macronutrient intake and also for losing body fat, because we can talk about, eating dietary fat or eating carbohydrates. That's one conversation. And then we can talk about being, metabolically flexible, or what our fuel are we using during exercise. But these are not, people want to kind of lump this all together and then say, well, we want to be burning more fat because then we're losing more body fat over time. And not quite true. That's actually why a long time ago people thought fasted cardio was this amazing thing. All the bodybuilders were doing it. I'm going to lose fat more efficiently, because when you are doing the exercise and you say, oh, are we oxidizing more fat? Yes, you are. But that doesn't mean that longer term, when you do that regularly, you actually lose more body fat. And so I think there's a bit of a disconnect there. And so it's funny that we're now seeing it, basically the opposite claims being made, that if you're training fasted, it's somehow going to be worse for you losing body fat, when these studies have been done. They've been done in women, and there's no difference in lean mass or body fat whether you're training fed or fasted.
Yeah. Do you mind explaining that a little bit more, the topic of fuel utilization and how that relates to whether or not you gain and lose fat, and why those things don't actually correlate that well?
Yeah, so when we think about what we're using for fuel, it's typically at different intensities. So are we using fat as fuel at these lower intensities, and then when are we going to start switching to using our glycogen for some higher intensity exercise? And when we think about the concept of that switch and being, metabolically flexible, that's something that you can build from doing more physical activity and being a kind of healthier person. Healthier people tend to be more metabolically flexible. But I had a question the other day about, well, so since women are more metabolically flexible than men in some of these studies during exercise, does that mean that we should be eating different ratios of fats and carbohydrates? And so that's when I realized, okay, there's a bit of a misunderstanding here, because it isn't like I'm really good at utilizing fat, and therefore I should have a predominantly high fat diet, or vice versa. And so I think there's a bit of that going around.
Yeah. And explain that, when you say women are a little bit more metabolically flexible than men, what does that mean in the first place?
So there are some studies looking at men and women, and at different exercise intensities, and basically meaning women can use fat as fuel for a little bit longer. And so the idea that you're kind of able to preserve those glycogen stores until you do tap into that higher intensity. And these are considerations that are important for high-level athletes who are training at really high intensities, or doing interval type training, or I guess it would apply for those kinds of high rocks stuff, or CrossFit, things where you do need to be able to tap into those different energy stores really efficiently in order to perform well. But for the average person who's just trying to lose some body fat or put on some muscle or stay generally fit, these are not nuances that are important to consider in your own diet and training necessarily.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool. So essentially, women are able to oxidize more fat during exercise at a higher intensity than men are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool. And how come that doesn't translate to what your diet should look like? And how come that doesn't translate? Because this is where people get confused. You're telling me I'm burning fat, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean I'm losing fat. Why?
Yeah. I mean, when we are using fat as fuel, then we're talking about fatty acids being, released, and using them for our energy, using them for our physical activity. When you're at these lower intensities, that is your kind of predominant fuel source, just to keep up all the functions that the body needs to do to perform, right? We're not just talking about exercise performance. We're using these fuel sources just throughout the day to perform our regular tasks. Um, when we think about fat loss, then the idea that we're burning fat is actually kind of a misnomer that we should probably not use, because you're not burning you're not it's not that you used more fat as fuel and therefore you lost fat. It's that you were able to decrease body fat stores, which is a different process and a different conversation that is the result of being in a calorie deficit. So maybe I'm not fully explaining that well enough, but it's not just a function of, oh, we need to rely on more fat and therefore we will lose more fat.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to explain because it's a weird concept, right? I've realized that some of these things too are a little bit easier to understand visually as well.
Yeah.
But there's some cool evidence also showing that like if you do use more fat as fuel during exercise, then the meal that you have after exercise at whatever point you have it after you exercise is more likely to be stored as body fat and less is going to be used to be stored as glycogen, for example. Whereas if you're doing high intensity exercise and you deplete glycogen stores and you're going to replenish those glycogen stores before using the excess energy to be stored as body fat, right? So it's really a balancing act more than anything. Again, that probably just adds more confusion to the people listening. Just know that just because you do low intensity exercise and you're using fat as fuel, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily burning belly fat and losing fat and getting leaner. It really does come down to the balance between how much energy you're burning, how much energy you're consuming. Not even just because I hate when people are like, are calories from day to day or is it from week to week? It's like
Yeah.
cumulative, right? It's like the time frame that you're looking at it is what matters because we go through deficits and surpluses throughout the specific day, right? It's like there are periods of time objectively in a day where you're leaner, and then at periods of time where you are a little bit less lean, but it's essentially flux, right? And it's the net difference between two over a certain period of time. I wanted to bring the conversation back to the topic of cortisol because everybody loves talking about cortisol nowadays. And there's a lot of confusion in terms of the role of cortisol as well. Because you and I would both agree that an acute increase in cortisol following exercise, specifically fasted exercise, is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, right? Can you explain what the role of cortisol is?
We know cortisol as our stress hormone, but it's also involved in a lot of other important functions. So it helps with blood sugar regulation, blood pressure regulation, it helps the immune system. So cortisol plays a lot of roles, and the stress hormone response is just the one that it's kind of known for. And it's true that cortisol is highest in the morning and lowest in the evening. And it's also true that prolonged fasting increases cortisol. Caffeine also increases cortisol, and all types of exercise increase cortisol. But this isn't like a perfect storm for terrible things to happen when you combine morning training with fasting and exercise, because the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, they're all working together to regulate that cortisol. So meaning it's going to increase because it's supposed to in response to whatever is going on physiologically and externally. And then when the stress trigger is removed, it will come back down. And so that's what I mean by healthy individuals. Like, you're supposed to have these short acute spikes. And I think the insulin example is a great one too, because if you, unless you're somebody who is diabetic, you don't need to worry about the status of your insulin, because we're going to eat a meal and insulin's going to increase, and then we don't have to worry about it. That just happens and it's automatic. And that's true with so many hormonal functions in the body. If we had to worry about manually increasing this or decreasing that, we would cease to function. So it's really important that these systems are designed as well as they are to kind of do things without us noticing.
Yeah. And in the context of exercise, isn't cortisol involved in like fuel mobilization and helping free up glucose for exercise as well. And that's one of the reasons why we see a spike during fasted exercise.
Yes.
Yeah. It's like, I guess this stuff is just complex and people, I don't want to say that people don't understand it. It's just that, like, yeah, they don't know the nuances, right? So you only hear about cortisol in the context of stress. And it's like, hey, actually, if you're exercising fasted and you haven't eaten anything, you don't have a lot of fuel coming in from the food that you consume because you haven't had anything. Cortisol actually helps up free up glucose so you can use that glucose to fuel exercise. That's one of the reasons too why we see a spike in cortisol after like prolonged exercise, and it's not just when you're fasted, right? And it's like everything in physiology is complicated. And what I typically tell people, Lauren, tell me if you agree with this. If you hear anybody say this hormone up, bad, this, this, whatever, good in all contexts, it's just wrong because it lacks nuance.
Yeah, I think again we're kind of trying to pull things from these unhealthy states and then
Mm-hmm.
wrap them in this fear package and deliver them to people, because it's true that if you do have Cushing's syndrome, so you're having chronically high elevated cortisol, you can have redistribution of body fat. And so this
Mm-hmm.
idea that you have cortisol belly or cortisol face is coming from that. But this is a medical condition that really isn't that common. And so the idea that everyone on the internet has chronically elevated cortisol is probably an overestimation. And hormones are complex.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to explain that, hey, this isn't something that you need to worry about. But people have been doing this in fitness forever. It's either like this hormone is the game changer. We did it with testosterone, like testosterone and muscle growth. Like if you don't have testosterone, then you're completely screwed. Everything about testosterone. Lift at a certain rep range and you'll increase your testosterone even more. And then we did it with insulin. Carbohydrates make you fat, and now we're doing it to cortisol, and tomorrow it'll be something else.
Yeah. Let's put this myth to rest. Is there any truth to the cortisol belly or cortisol face thing, the way that you see it on social media?
No.
You're ruffling a lot of feathers here, Lauren.
If you truly have chronically elevated or chronically low cortisol, then these are both a problem. And those are a symptom of an underlying health condition that needs to be addressed, such that you can get back to having those normal fluctuations that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But when there's also, I think, this idea that when we wake up in the morning, we're an empty tank. We have no fuel in us. We have no glycogen stores. We can't do anything. So we need to eat right away in order to be productive. And that's not true either. Because
Yeah.
again, it's not like the body resets at midnight and what you ate yesterday no longer is affecting your physiology today.
Yeah. It's like we all live in a simulation. We all get turned off at night, and we're a completely new person plugged back into the matrix the next morning.
That's
Okay.
really what it seems like, though, because we have these conversations about what I'm doing in this 24-hour period, and not even 24 hours because we're not awake for the full 24 hours.
Yeah, that's such a great way to put it. Now, women's health has really sort of kind of exploded on social media recently, which is great, right? Like, I love seeing more people talk about women's health specifically. And there are some really big voices leading the conversation, like Dr. Stacey Sims. I feel like everybody knows who Dr. Stacey Sims is nowadays. I didn't know who she was just a couple months ago, and I've been seeing her pop up more and more on my social media. And obviously, I think she has some great things that she says. I think she has some pretty controversial things that she says. Uh, I wanted to ask, what's your take on her work, and where do you think it aligns with the evidence that we have, and where does it diverge?
I agree that the conversation around women is really great. And I think the message that women are different is something that really resonates with a lot of women because they've heard that we're so underrepresented in the research, or that we need to learn more about women in this context. And so having this message around female specific programming or nutrition or training is resonating with people because they feel like, I've been following these programs that were made for the men, and now somebody's offering me something that is for me.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. And when I started doing research in my master's program, I wanted to study women. And I said, hey, where can I go where someone is going to let me do a study in female participants? And the same goes for when I did my PhD, because I was personally interested in exploring these potential sex-based differences. If there were differences, I wanted to know about them. And the reality is that we have more and more and more data in women. We have been replicating these studies that were originally done in men in female populations. And what we're seeing time and time again is, even though those differences were perhaps reasonable to hypothesize, we actually aren't that different when it comes to how we are adapting to exercise, when it comes to different variables of training, and when it comes to how we should approach our nutrition.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Because another thing that people lack understanding of is that our bodies have many different redundancies and different redundant mechanisms, right? Whereas, like, if women might have a little bit higher of this, men have a little bit lower of that, then men have a little bit higher of that and a little bit lower of this, and essentially the outcome is kind of the same, right? Um, I know that doesn't give much context at all, but I bring that up because there's so much conversation around this one particular molecule that does this one particular thing, which is true. And then there's like, it results in this specific outcome, which is not true. Because again, mechanisms are complicated. It's never just one molecule, one thing, one outcome. We see this a lot in the nutrition space when people talk about different types of dietary fats. And they're like, well, these fats are really high in omega 6s. And omega 6s can be inflammatory, or they are inflammatory, is the language that's being used. And it's like, well, it's not that simple because, yes, omega 6s can go down an inflammatory pathway, but they can also just be used for energy production. And they can be used for a million different things. It doesn't mean that just because it can do this, it will do this, right? I think a recent post that both you and I were talking about regarding Stacy is this whole concept of women not responding well to calorie deficits or fasted exercise the same way men do because of particular types of neurons in the hypothalamus, which makes women more sensitive to nutrient deficiencies. Therefore, they can't store energy as glycogen, and they're more likely to store it as body fat. So men and women don't respond well to calorie deficits, or men and women respond differently to calorie deficits. Like, I want to steelman this argument and just ask, are there any parts of that message that are accurate at all? And what parts are not accurate?
This is packaged as a very confident, pretty major sex difference that, and I looked far and wide, where is this message coming from? And so this kisspeptin is the kind of culprit, supposedly, and that has shown largely plays a role in reproductive function. In terms of the effects on metabolism, we know very, very little about kisspeptin. The studies are predominantly in rodents, and so you can look at a genetic knockout model of a rodent, meaning the thing about rodent studies is you can delete a gene, you can delete a gene receptor, you can overexpress a gene, you can do all sorts of things to try to identify a mechanism or a question like, if we didn't have this, what would happen? And then from those results, you can say, oh, well, then I guess that is really important for that. And these are interesting models because they can then generate more hypotheses like, if, can we drill down to this mechanism about the need for this one thing in order for that to kind of function normally in this model. Now, clearly, humans are much more complex and our physiology is much more dynamic, and often these findings that we see in rodent models don't end up panning out down the road when we actually do these clinical trials in humans. And that's why it's incredibly important that we do those trials. So the idea that because in this rodent model, they saw, well, when you delete the receptor for kisspeptin, that then the female mice gain weight and the male mice do not in this one study. That's the hypothesis that's fueling that whole message you just went over. And that's a big, big problem.
Yeah. So essentially, we don't really have any evidence to support that claim whatsoever.
Not at all. And the only 2 human studies on kisspeptin have shown that it's not even involved in appetite regulation or nutrient sensitivity.
Interesting. And how much evidence do we have to show that women respond well to a calorie deficit?
A ton. That's the
Yeah,
thing. That's the thing. That's why it's so crazy, but it sounds so scientific and confident.
yeah. Well, here's the thing, Lauren, and here's my speculation. And you mentioned it earlier, right? That so many women have tried all of these different programs and struggled with health and fitness. So it makes logical sense to then think, well, it's not the program because so many people have had success with it. It must be me, right? It's a logical way of thinking. And the truth is, at least from my perspective, that one, most programs, quote unquote, right, that we see online are kind of destined to fail anyways, because they're either like very cookie cutter or they focus on the wrong things or they don't help people with the mindset side of things. And we know how important consistency is, which we talked about earlier. And it's like, it's not it's not you. It's definitely the program and the approaches that you've been using. But when you've tried 5, 6, 7 different things and none of them, quote unquote, worked, it's easy to blame yourself. I think there are also some practical differences between men and women when it comes to the ease of staying on a calorie deficit. And that's literally just differences in body size and energy expenditure, right? Like in general, men are a lot bigger than women. Men have a higher energy expenditure than women. However, when you go out to eat and you order something, portion sizes are the same, right? If I burn 3,000 calories, throwing out a random number, and Lauren, you burn 2,000 calories, and we go out to have a slice of pizza, that slice of pizza has the same number of calories for you and I, but it represents a much larger percentage of your energy expenditure than it does mine. So and you're not just going to have half of a slice of pizza, right? So I think there are some practical examples that might make it a little bit more difficult for women to stay consistent with a deficit, especially if you're smaller. We also know in nutrition research how much food proximity and portion sizes affect eating behaviors too, because we don't just eat based off hunger, right? Like, yeah, there are some things that probably make it a little bit more difficult for women, particularly smaller women, maybe women who are postmenopausal and haven't focused on resistance training and also have low muscle mass, right? But this whole concept of like our physiology is totally different just isn't true. So I'm happy that you're bringing that up.
Yeah, I think especially in the post menopause group, it's very easy to target them. And I see that all over social media these days because you have a group of women that are kind of confused and feel like their body is changing and maybe they're experiencing menopause related symptoms and they're just being bombarded with you need to be on this special anti-inflammatory diet and you need to buy a weighted vest and you need to go on hormone therapy and you need this supplement stack and you should only do this kind of cardio. And I mean, it's just a mess with the messaging that is targeted towards them. And so I think that this idea of, hey, we need to treat women differently, we need to train women differently has gone from what is positive, what should be positive, hey, let's talk about the menstrual cycle, let's talk about menopause, to you are a completely different species because you have a menstrual cycle or because you are transitioning through menopause.
That's funny. You are not human. You are a woman.
Right.
um, let me ask you this. Oh, where was I going with this? Oh, okay. With women specifically going, who are in peri or postmenopause, why do you think so many women in that age range do struggle with weight loss?
I think it's probably this perfect storm that starts with inadvertent changes in diet and exercise. Because if you think about the timing of it, often there are other things that are changing at that life stage. So perhaps you used to cook regularly for your family and now your kids have moved out of your house, and so there's some changes in your dietary behaviors. Or perhaps you have retired and so you're not getting in as much daily physical activity because you used to walk around a bunch in the office or from building to building on campus or whatever you did for work. Perhaps you are experiencing debilitating symptoms and you're not sleeping well,
Mm.
and therefore you're less likely to adhere to your diet, or you don't have as much motivation to train. You might be experiencing some symptoms of depression, which also are more likely to decrease physical activity. So I think there's a lot of going on there that it's not necessarily, oh, your physiology changed. It's that all of these things around eating behavior, physical activity, exercise, your overall lifestyle, those start to add up. And we don't always notice that we made those changes because they weren't intentional.
Yeah. And even talking about physiological changes, people don't understand how much like poor sleep and stress negatively impact your physiology, right? And like
Yeah.
you mentioned, if you are having pretty bad symptoms, you're not sleeping well, you're having a ton of hot flashes, maybe you're feeling stressed because you see your body changing, like those things exacerbate the issues that you're facing, right? So like it's not that women in that particular age range or going through perimenopause or even postmenopausal doesn't make things more difficult. It definitely does. Because I mean, like I literally see it every single day when we talk to women who are in that age range who potentially want to work with us. But it's like, it's not for the reason that you think, right? It's not because menopause inherently causes something to happen in your body, then there's like a switch and now what you used to do doesn't work. I've also realized, Lauren, that a lot of women that are in that age range, let's say like mid 50s or so, who have just gone through menopause, obviously we know that there is an accelerated rate of muscle loss, after the age of like 35, 40, and that gets exacerbated after menopause. Uh, a lot of women in that age range also come from the background of like cardio, 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 be skinny, lose weight. And that exacerbates the issue with muscle loss as well. And then they have really low muscle mass. So even though they might not be overweight, they're not comfortable with their body composition. Their energy expenditure is really low because they're not big people to start with. And they're like, I think I need to eat less. I need to eat less. I've seen this happen so many times, Lauren, where we've worked with women who are particularly postmenopausal, who don't have any experience with resistance training, who come from a background of doing excessive amounts of cardio and restricting food. And it's a hard conversation to have because it's almost like everything we're saying is the complete opposite of what they've ever thought they need to do. But we're like, listen, you're not going to starve yourself. And we know that starving yourself is relative too, because sometimes it's like, I don't eat a lot, but we know that food choices matter in terms of caloric density, right? But we're going to focus on properly fueling yourself. Let's focus on protein. A lot of these women don't ever really focus much on protein in the first place. And we're really going to emphasize resistance training. And we'll see really big improvements in body composition, even though the scale weight might not change a ton, right? What are your thoughts? I know I just shared a ton. What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I think unfortunately women feel intimidated by resistance training. It feels really confusing. And there's also a lot of messaging online that you have to do 5 by 5 if you're peri or post menopause, or you have to do like barbell bench press, squats, and deadlifts if you're peri or postmenopause, which is just absurd messaging. Um, and so I'm always trying to push the narrative like, hey, it has to be challenging and you have to do it consistently. And it needs to be progressive in nature. So if you can increase the load, then that's great. If you can increase the number of reps from what you did last week, then let's try to move towards that. But if you have access to one of those machine circuits at your commercial gym, that's a great place to start. You don't ever have to touch a barbell, and you don't need to be doing 5x5.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great points. And I think a lot of that messaging also comes, Lauren, I don't fault some of these people because people in the fitness space are not all PhDs, right? The vast majority aren't, right? They're personal trainers, they care about helping people, and like they're just sharing kind of what worked for them, and they truly believe like this is what you got to do, right? Like I see a lot of postmenopausal women who do the online coaching thing, and they coach specifically women in that age range, and they went from like doing cardio to heavy lifting, and they're like, the secret is heavy squats, heavy deadlifts. And like I kind of understand their perspective, and I don't think that messaging is that damaging, because I think you could use a little bit of common sense to be like, well, leg press is pretty similar to a squat, right? I think it's a little bit more damaging when we talk about people who are seen as leaders or experts in the space claiming all sorts of crazy stuff without having much evidence to substantiate it. And the unfortunate part, as you and I chatted about on social media too, is like these are the people that are propped up in our space, right? Unfortunately, Lauren, you're not going to be propped up for saying like, hey, perimenopausal and postmenopausal women, there's nothing wrong with you. It's like your lifestyle has changed, right? And it's like that's the unfortunate. Your lifestyle has changed, right? And it's like that's always a certain degree of misinformation get more popularity and fame than those that are speaking the truth. I can't wrap my head around it.
I know. I mean, it's this whole, you get so much attention if you say, you were wrong about everything and here's the truth, or these are the 5 foods that you need to eat. And it's like, are we still doing this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think a lot about this stuff from a psychological perspective too, because those types of things catch people's attention,
Yeah.
right? And the truth is like if somebody, general public type of person who doesn't know anything about health and fitness, like that catches attention, right? It catches my attention, even though I know it's not true. Like I'm like, oh, I wonder what they're gonna say, right? So
What are the
maybe
5 foods?
yeah, exactly. Maybe people like you and I can learn a little bit in terms of the marketing side of things and then use that in a positive way. Cool. So we've been talking a lot about what's not true, but let's talk about some things that may be true. Are there some important differences between men and women when it comes to optimizing training and nutrition for health and body composition?
Honestly, not much. What I see from the literature and then also from my personal experience coaching both men and women is that the most important thing is that you're coaching the individual and you're basing your
Mm,
program on their goals and preferences, and you're giving them something that is sustainable. And I wouldn't approach that any differently based on biological sex.
yeah, because, and here's the thing too that people might not understand the concept of effect sizes, right? And what I mean by that is like, let's say there are some biological differences between men and women for some of these variables. The effect size, which just means like how much of an effect something has, is pretty small. And we know that individual differences have a much larger effect size, right? And again, even when we look at research studies and we publish the average outcome, for example, I think a great example of this is talking about volume in response to muscle growth, right? In general, the research clearly shows that higher training volume results in more muscle growth. On average, being the key word. Because if we look at the individual responses, there are people that respond worse with higher volume. I'm sure that might be due to recovery or a number of reasons, but the individual differences, the effect size of individual differences largely outweighs the effect size of any sex related differences, correct?
That's right. I mean, whenever we see really pick your outcome. There's going to be differences between individuals, and that's why we're encouraged to report those individual data points and not just the group average, because you can see, okay, this was the group average, but on the low end it was this, and on the high end it was this, and here are all the people in between. And regardless of the outcome, we're always seeing this spread in the data. And when we account for sex, it's very rare that when we're looking at some sort of exercise induced adaptation that isn't a function of, your baseline, right? So there are differences between men and women at baseline because men go through puberty, they have a surge in testosterone, it does increase muscle mass. So if you have two untrained adults, the man will have a higher baseline muscle mass than the woman. So that is a difference, but your increase in muscle mass in response to training relative to that baseline is going to be fairly similar. So we need to and the things that get you there, the reps, the sets, the volume, the exercise selection, the rest periods, all of that, from a practical perspective, is going to work very similarly regardless of your sex. But there might be some things to consider because of you as an individual, and you can learn that, or you can work with a coach to really help you find that optimal spot for you.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you brought this point up of the fact that, yes, men have more muscle than women because our starting point is different. But relatively, the amount of muscle growth is pretty similar, right? And I bring this up, and to put that simply, it's like women grow muscle the same way and to the same extent that men can grow muscle. And I think it's really important to bring this point up and analyze the parallels between this concept and what we mentioned about Stacy talking about particular neurons and the way that men and women handle calorie deficit and fasting differently, right? Because it would be the same argument as saying, imagine we had no data on the fact that women can build muscle similarly to men. And somebody just came out and said, like, oh, women have way less testosterone than men do. And testosterone is a key hormone that's involved in muscle growth. And if you have low testosterone, you can't really build much muscle. That's why women shouldn't focus on resistance training, because their physiology is not optimized for building muscle. They should actually focus more on cardiovascular exercise because of insert other random mechanism, right? It's like, this is why I was saying earlier that just because we know that this one thing is involved in this particular mechanism, it doesn't mean that the outcome is practically going to be influenced, because the shit is complicated, guys. It's influenced by so many different things, right?
And it's so rare that we can ever explain one particular adaptation with a single mechanism. We can just laser focus in and say it's that thing and nothing else, and that's what is responsible for what we're seeing here. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, and especially when we're talking about hormones work together. And so
Yep.
if we're going to talk about estrogen, then we also need to talk about progesterone. We also need to talk about luteinizing hormone, and we view all of these. It's so easy to just kind of cherry pick one thing, and it's dangerous. And when you see people citing these studies, often they end up just citing a review paper, which is basically an opinion paper on a topic. Yep. That is an overview of the literature, and they are using this to kind of conceal the fact that all the citations in there are those rodent studies. And so when we ask, hey, can I see the data? It really needs to be data in humans that shows if this, then that, with an intervention. And so, an example would be men and women both went on a very tightly controlled calorie deficit, and the men lost weight and the women did not. And that would be the data required to support this claim. And so all of the noise around this mechanism or that pathway or this neuron or that hormone, none of that is relevant until we have the paper that shows, okay, we put you in a deficit and there's a clear difference here, and it doesn't work for women. And we definitely don't have that data.
Yeah, my professor, my PhD mentor used to always say that I forget the specific phrase, but something along the lines of like we ignore the health of the forest while like analyzing the health of a leaf or something like that. In the sense of like we're so hyperfixated on mechanisms, and this is not just people on social media. This is like the scientific field as a whole. And mechanisms are obviously important because we want to understand why things happen and be able to discover different things. But my professor was always a big believer. Like we just did clinical work in our lab with some minor work in terms of mechanisms, but he was like, "Hey, if we know that this thing does that thing, why do we need to know? Why do we need to spend another $50 million figuring out why?" Right? He's like, "We know it works. It's like who?" And I know that it lacks nuance as well because it's important to understand why. But like, there's a really strong message there too that sometimes we really focus so much on the specific mechanisms. It's like, hey, it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually work that way whatsoever, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
there's a difference between what is interesting from a scientific perspective to what is useful and practical and
yeah,
actionable to the public. And so that's the difference of how we should be communicating and what we should be communicating.
yeah, completely agree. And you mentioned earlier even this concept of like mechanisms being presented in a linear fashion, right? Like this molecule does this one thing, and this happens. Have you ever, you probably have in a textbook or even like in our lab, we had a big poster of um, how like metabolism works. And you can't even see the names of the molecules because there's just arrows everywhere,
Yeah.
right? It's like, and it's like it's funny because even when I started my master's and you start taking some more advanced metabolism classes and you're learning about things like glucose metabolism, and it's like glucose to glucose 6 phosphate to this, and then eventually acetyl CoA, and then that gets converted into ATP, and it's like very linear. And then you zoom out and see how like everything affects each other. It's practically impossible to understand the whole picture, right? And when we look at these posters, it's just the whole picture of what we understand. Who knows how much is being influenced by what we don't understand, right? And I bring this up because even talking about like the concept of testosterone, or what's the specific neuron again?
Kisspeptin.
Kisspeptin, right? It's like, hey, if we decrease this a little bit, or remove this or add this, we don't know how many other hundreds of things are being influenced, and the outcome might be the exact same because of redundancies, right? Lauren, one thing I wanted to ask you is, and I could be wrong here, is there a difference between typically how much exercise volume women can handle compared to men and their ability to recover from higher volumes, or is that not really different at all?
No, I mean that was a hypothesis that was out there, but again, we just see differences on an individual level way more than we see, sex-based differences per se. And the hypothesis that was sort of generating some of this was that estrogen might have this protective effect and that therefore women would be able to recover faster because estrogen regulates satellite cells,
Mm,
um, which is another example of rodent data, which is cool. I mean, you take rodents, they remove the ovaries, essentially shut down hormone production. Looked like that had an effect on muscle mass, and then kind of reversing that by injecting with estrogen, and then seeing, oh, hey, there are estrogen receptors on satellite cells, and so there's a lot of this that makes for an interesting hypothesis, but once again doesn't really seem to
yeah.
pan out when we actually look at that in humans.
Yeah. And this is completely anecdotal, but based off my experience working with both men and women, I have again anecdotally realized that some of the women that we can work with kind of across the board seem to be able to handle a little bit higher volume better. And my hypothesis is two things. One is just general intensity when it comes to training in Gen Pop with people who are fairly untrained. I feel like sometimes men can kind of just be a little bit more aggressive and competitive and push near failure a little bit more. And it's a skill, right? Because we know that training close to failure contributes to fatigue. And then I also wonder, and I don't have any evidence to say support this, but I wonder how much total load, like absolute load, influences fatigue and recoverability as well, because there's a difference between putting 400 pounds on your back and 100 pounds on your back, even though they might be the same relative effort. What are your thoughts on that? I know we're totally speculating here.
No, I actually said the exact same thing the other day. I think that because even if you think about squat and the overall, it's not just about the fatigue in your lower body. It's also the act of actually bracing and holding the bar. And so it may be kind of systemically than if you're somebody who's using much, much higher loads, then you are going to get kind of beat up more easily.
Yeah.
But I don't think we have any evidence to support that necessarily, but it would make sense.
Yeah, it would make sense. And in a completely different context, and I don't know if this is analogous in any way, but let's say you get punched with like 100 pounds of force versus getting punched with like 10 pounds of force, right? Like, obviously, the 100 pounds of force would hurt more. I don't know if it's enough to kill you if you get hit in the face. I don't know. But probably more bruising. It's going to take longer to recover. And I'm sure there's probably a similar sort of effect there. What I wanted to ask is there's also a lot of talk around tailoring training for women, specifically around the menstrual cycle. Is there any evidence to support that there should be changes to training around the menstrual cycle? What's true? What's not?
The only thing that's true is that if you have menstrual symptoms at some point during your cycle, for most women, this would be a couple days before you get your period or maybe the first couple days of the cycle, then you should feel free to auto regulate and back off intensity or skip the gym entirely, whatever you need to do on for that 1 or 2 sessions. This idea that you should be making these drastic pre-planned adjustments for a week or even 2 weeks at a time based on cycle phase are absolutely a terrible idea. They won't help get you towards your goals because you have to train consistently if you are going to improve. And so when we talk about muscle adaptations to resistance training, we need that stimulus regularly. And so we need, if we want to get stronger, we need to practice those movement patterns regularly. So all of this kind of gimmicky stuff about based on hormone profile, you should be doing yoga this week. Whatever your goal is what you should be doing every week. And changing your exercise on a weekly basis is a really, really suboptimal way to train.
Yeah, and I think it's an attractive messaging for the type of person that may not enjoy training that much. And they're like, oh, once a month for a whole week, I should just do this other easy thing, and this is actually optimal. It's like it plays to all the psychological triggers that would entice somebody to want to do that, right? In general, as humans, we want to move towards things that are novel because they're interesting. We want to move towards things that feel easier, not more difficult, right? That's usually when I talk about from the nutrition perspective with people when they're dieting, I'm like, being a little bit more flexible with your diet just makes it feel a little easier, so you're more likely to stay consistent. And it's like, hey, if somebody is, relatively newer at training, they don't enjoy it that much, and you're telling them that once a month they actually shouldn't train really hard because of these hormonal changes, that's going to make it feel easier. That's a novel message they haven't heard before. Like it's attractive, right? Like we could really break down a lot of this messaging into like normal psychological type of triggers that would make them more enticing, and like they all follow the same sort of pattern. Um, yeah. Anything else you wanted to say there? Go ahead.
I think it also goes back to the women needing something really tailored and kind of special, and that is, oh, I'm now seen and heard. And I mean, I get accused of promoting masculine training because I've said, hey, you don't need to worry about this, and I've studied it like in a very, very in-depth capacity. But people are extremely tied to this concept and very triggered when you push back.
Yeah. I'm really happy that you brought up you mentioned like I studied this at a high capacity, not just at a high capacity, at likely it's like the highest way of studying something, right? I bring this up because even I get these messages sometimes when I talk about pretty simple nutrition related topics. People are like, well, what about insert doctor's name, right? And they say this other thing. And I'm like, guys, it's just not true. And like, I did this, like my PhD, this is what I focused on. This is what I lived and breathed like every day for years of my life. And they're like, yeah, but they researched it too. It's like, no, they didn't research it. Like researching something, that's another term. Like we need two different terms for this, right? It's
Yeah.
like maybe you looked something up or you read about something, but like you did not research it. Doing research is a very different thing than what people say. I researched something, right? It's like again, you can find evidence to support any claim. We can't focus on single individual studies. We got to look at the totality of research. Most people, when they research stuff, aren't even looking at research itself. People who do the research understand how finicky even results can be due to methodology that's being used, right? It's like people do not understand that level of nuanced. Because even sometimes, Lauren, I've been sent studies that are clinical trials um, that quote unquote support the outcome that people are saying, and then you look at the methods and you're like, no, but this isn't done correctly, right? It's
Yeah.
like you can't say that somebody that the caloric intake was controlled for and then not actually measured caloric intake, right? And just did some self-reported data, and like that's not really going to tell us if the caloric intake is the same. You didn't measure it, or the statistics that you use don't really tell us, like it's not the correct statistical test for the outcome that you're trying to measure. And it's like I feel like it's a never ending battle, and it's a battle that we will eventually lose because those nuances are really important, and unless you've dedicated a big part of your life to studying those nuances, people will never understand, and those nuances are not attractive, so people don't even care in the first place.
I know, and it's hard because I think even people who are genuinely interested in looking up that abstract or typing in that PubMed ID and they are trying to be evidence based, it's very difficult to be able to effectively analyze all of those components you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And then of course there's going to be differences that I will see in this one area because I'm so familiar with the literature on this particular topic. And I'm sure the same would go for you. So even us, we can't necessarily critically evaluate all of the science across the board to an equal level.
Yeah. 100% agreed. And last thing I'll say here, because we were talking about Dr. Lane Norton before we started recording, he famously has said, and it's kind of a joke, but kind of not a joke. And I say kind of a joke because he has guides to help teach Gen Pop on like how to accurately read and interpret research, and we know how difficult that is. But like, people will ask him frequently, like, how do I read the research? How do I interpret it? And his response is just don't. Like, don't try to read it and interpret it for yourself because like it's unfortunate, but it's really hard to do, right? It's like it's a stupid analogy, but I think it would be the same as somebody saying like, "Hey, Lauren, how do I fly a plane?" And
Right.
it's like, well, you need to go through all the training to learn how to fly a plane. You don't just like Google a video on how to fly a plane and get in a plane and start clicking buttons because that's going to end up poorly, right? It's like it's what people are trying to do with research. Obviously, the repercussions aren't nearly as large, and that's why it turns into a huge mess. But Lauren, maybe we could end the conversation with this question. So you work essentially at the intersection between research and scientific communication, right? And I think this space, and both you and I do pretty much the same thing, is really important because there are researchers who just do research, and then there are people who spew crap to the general public, let's say in the health and fitness space, and that the bridging the gap is really important. There aren't many people who have the scientific expertise, but then can communicate that effectively to the lay person. Because I've also realized that a lot of researchers are, for lack of a better term, poor communicators. They don't know how to explain things simply using normal language, right? What do you wish more evidence based practitioners understood about applying the science to everyday people?
I think it's good that people are interested in science. I think it's good that people want to be evidence based. But I think, well, first, we need to know who is actually delivering that good quality information, who is actually a reliable source for interpreting the science that you're interested in. And I think it's important to understand if there is some sort of underlying agenda. And you can sometimes see that based on the messaging overall or the pushing of a particular product, unfortunately. But I think I wish people understood that science is always evolving. It's building on the science that came before it. And so when you see a scientist say something that maybe is an adjustment of what they said 5 years ago, that's a good thing. That means that we got more data and we learned more and we were able to refine our understanding of a topic. Maybe we found a better way to measure something. Maybe we realized that there was a problem with some of the data that we had collected previously. There was a variety of reasons, but that is science. Science is supposed to change, and when people kind of view this as flip-flopping or I can't trust science, but that's the wrong understanding. And so I hope people will start to appreciate the fact that more data is always good news, and that allows us to increase our understanding. And in some cases, that might mean changing our opinion.
Yeah. What do you personally find most difficult about doing science communication?
It's difficult to be complete,
Mm.
and also get the direct point across. Because I find if I try to share too much detail, then you start to lose people. So it's a really difficult balance, because you want to explain the big picture, but that's really hard to do in a minute or in a one square.
Yeah, no, it's practically impossible. And I do think that's why long form content like this, like podcasts, have become so popular too, specifically in like the science space. If you look at a lot of the like, and we could also argue without saying any names that some large science podcasts are not that scientific in the first place. But aside from the point, it's like the general interest in science based topics seems to be more popular amongst like long form content than short form content. Like if you look at Instagram, the stuff that blows up is not an in depth explanation on like whatever scientific topic, right? It's like silly stuff or 3 tips to blank. But there are a ton of podcasts that are really in depth scientific podcasts that keep growing and are like top charts and all that stuff. Definitely not mine, hopefully one day. But it's really cool to see that people are interested in science overall. Before we end the podcast, is there anything else you want to share with the audience?
If you like breakdowns of research, then check out
Yeah,
massresearchreview.com.
yeah. So massresearchreview.com is one place where people can find you. Where else can they find you?
Instagram, Dr. Lauren CS1.
Yeah.
And my new podcast with Dr. Eric Trexler, Front Page Fitness.
Front Page Fitness. That's a catchy name. I tried for like weeks to come up with a catchy name and I just couldn't. And everything that I liked, I then just like hated the next day. I was like, I'm just going to use my name. But I'm thinking now of rebranding and putting the word fitness or like nutrition in the title because I feel like that helps with like the search engine stuff of people finding stuff on like Apple Podcasts or Spotify if they've never found you before. Anyways, I have, as you can tell, my brain is really scattered and I can just like go in a million different directions. But I appreciate you for being here today, Lauren. Before we hop off, you mentioned people finding you at Mass Research Review. Can you explain a little bit about what Mass Research Review is in the first place?
Sure. So I co own Mass with three other PhDs: Eric Trexler, Eric Helms, Mike Zordos. And we all have sort of specific areas of expertise in the exercise, nutrition, health space. And so basically, each month we write articles or put together video presentations explaining and breaking down some of the latest research in the space. And we do a real in-depth job of critiquing the methodology if need be, analyzing the statistical approach if need be, and then kind of wrapping it up in a way that allows you to practically use the information for yourself or for your clients.
Yeah, I love that. And I wanted to bring that up because uh, Mass is one of the sources of information that I really respect. I transparently haven't been reading much recently, but I used to read a ton of. And we mentioned earlier, like, how do I learn about research? These sorts of publications are the best places to learn. So if you're interested in learning more, traditionally more specific around sports sciences, correct? But you mentioned it's been expanding a little bit more in terms of general health, nutrition. If you guys enjoy learning by reading and reading really in-depth articles, I definitely encourage you to go ahead and check out Mass. With that being said, again, Lauren, thank you for being here today. If you've listened to the whole episode, I appreciate your support. I hope you enjoyed it. and I'll catch you in next week's episode. Bye.